Hello. I'm sorry we can't interact as if we're at a normal conference presentation, but I'm excited to use this video opportunity to share some of the work that my team is doing to try and improve the quality of sounds used in auditory alarms in medical devices. Now, why would we be focused on such a seemingly small and somewhat obscure reason or area? Well, my lab at McMaster University is called the Maple Lab, and we research a wide range of issues relating to music, acoustics, perception, and learning. And in drawing on this interdisciplinary team of research and a wide network of collaborators, we're interested in trying to do things like take what we know about sound from music perception and the construction of musical instruments and see if we can apply it usefully to improve the way sound is used in devices. One area we're particularly engaged in at the moment is the design and redesign of auditory alarms in medical devices. Well, I hope you haven't spent a great deal of time in a hospital environment. If you have, you've probably noticed that there's a strong cacophony of beeps and whirs and clicks and buzzes, some of which relates to the machines and the noises that they're making, but many of them are sounds that could be designed in different ways. Now, the design of the specific sounds used to give alerts to medical professionals is often almost an afterthought in building devices, and the focus is typically and understandably on making sure the devices help to keep patients alive. But these devices make many hundreds of alarms per patient per hospital per day, which results in a large cacophony of sound. The challenge from a health perspective is that this large amount of sound actually interferes with patient recovery and is also constructed in a way that makes it sometimes hard for the teams trying to help patients to effectively communicate. So if you spent time in a hospital, you might hear a soundscape like this. Now, if that's what you're hearing, it can become very difficult for a patient to recover after surgery because the rest becomes very problematic because the sounds are often interrupting the patient. So one thing we're interested in now is can we design these sounds in a way that can be just as communicative for the medical professionals without being so annoying and problematic for patients? To do this, we're looking in particular at one property we spend a lot of time exploring in my lab that I just wanted to outline here because it's not often discussed as much in these contexts. So this property is amplitude envelope, which refers to the temporal structure of a sound. So percussive sounds, which come from impact events, have a very short onset period and then immediately move into this offset period with a long period of sustain. So if I were to flick a ruler off the edge of a table, you would see the motion of the ruler would gradually be dampened over time, and that's a visual representation of what happens in a lot of impact situations. So you might have heard these kinds of sounds when two glasses clink together like this. Now, although these sounds are fairly common in nature and in many ways very pleasing to listen to, they're not often the kinds of sounds that are used in medical devices. These sounds are more what I call flat sounds, which have a sharp onset and a long sustained period, followed by a rapid offset period. Here are some examples of some flat tones you might have heard. Now we know this offset period is a very important property of natural sounds. And so from prior research, we know they're helpful in doing things like trying to understand the hollowness of a tube from listening to the sound of it being struck. It's also useful in allowing us to understand the kinds of materials that are involved in an impact event. In some previous studies, my team has even shown that sounds with these decaying percussive envelopes are easier to associate with everyday objects than sounds with these more typically used flat envelopes. And the reason why that's particularly important is that when we apply that to the context of auditory alarms, we're in a situation where not only do we need to hear a lot of sound, but also remember what they are associated with. Now, the next step about how we're going to design the stimuli comes from some of our experience and interest in music, so I just wanted to briefly talk about musical timbre. So if we look at timbre of different instruments, which is sort of like an instrument's acoustic fingerprint, we can see some striking differences in the visual display of this information from instruments with very different sounds. So, for example, if we look at a display of the energy in a clarinet as opposed to the energy found in a trumpet, what we have here on the y-axis is the amount of energy now from each of those instruments, and on the x-axis we have that broken apart by different frequency component or different overtone. Now, if these musical terms all seem a little mysterious, it's not a big concern, because I just want to draw your attention here to the difference in the amount of energy on the trumpet versus that of the clarinet. Now, what I'm showing you here is called a power spectrum, and it's the way in which these sounds are normally visualized. And while it's helpful in that it shows here very clearly one of the reasons why a trumpet sounds different than a clarinet, these figures don't actually represent anything about the way these sounds evolve or change over time. And I think that omission is actually quite important, because it's the change over time, or the temporal structure, that forms the heart of the studies that we're doing now. And so if we plot these same sounds with a third dimension that's actually showing time, you can see that while there are some differences in the harmonic content between these two, there's also a huge amount of temporal variation or change that gets lost when we're just looking at the representation I showed you on the previous slide. So we can look now at representations for several different musical instruments, and while they differ in the specifics of how these overtones are structured, what we can see is they all exhibit constant temporal variation. And I wanted to take a moment to make that point, because if we compare that with the classic flat tone that's often used in auditory research and is often the basis for these hospital alarms, we can see there's just a world of difference in the temporal complexity. Whereas natural sounds are constantly varying in their temporal structure, what we see in these flat tones is this unchanging amount of energy between when it turns on and when it turns off. Now, the reason that's so important is because I think that's one of the reasons, and one of the primary reasons, why these sounds are so annoying and so aversive. Now, obviously in a hospital environment, we want the alarms to be alerting. We want doctors to give attention to these and make sure they don't just sort of disappear into the background. So the question we're exploring here is there a way we can make them just as alerting and just as informative, but less annoying, so they're not as problematic from a patient care perspective? Alarms in medical devices often follow this global medical standard set forth by the International Electrotechnic Commission. So this gives a variety of either 3-note sequences or 5-note sequences depending on the priority of the alarms, and they're set out in several different conditions. There's a lot of details out there about the specifics of those alarms, but I just wanted to point out that's the general sound set that we're using for these experiments. The main thing we're exploring here is how the temporal structure can be varied in a way that's a little more patient-friendly. So in a typical instantiation of these sequences, we'd have 3 tones that are fairly brief, about 200 milliseconds each, and I'll play you an example of that later on, but we're taking that idea and varying it and making percussive shapes for each individual note. So here each note can be a little bit longer, and they can also blend together, and it results in a very different soundscape. So first I'll play you the original sort of standard IEC instantiation of an alarm, and then here's our version. Here's another one. So in this paradigm, we give participants an opportunity to do some studying where they hear the alarms and they're asked to pair that with a certain message. They train on this over several blocks until they reach a certain criteria. Then we give them a break where they played mini golf on a computer just to give them some kind of distraction. Then we had an evaluation phase where we played the alarm and asked them to guess the message the alarm was referring to. And then at the end, we had them make a rating of annoyance. Now, there wasn't much difference between the percussive and flat alarms based on that rating of annoyance. And so what I want to focus on, there wasn't much difference for the evaluation phase for the memory, but what I want to focus right on now is the differences in that annoyance rating at the end. Because here we saw some pretty clear distinctions. So on the y-axis now we have the proportion of times that that alarm was chosen as more annoying than the other. And we can see that whether participants trained on the flat tones here or trained on the percussive tones here, at the end when they were given a flat and a percussive tone and asked to choose which one was more annoying, they were overwhelmingly choosing the flat tones, regardless of the kinds of sounds on which they trained at the beginning. Now that's a really important outcome because we're not seeing any difference in memory, and in previous studies we found they're no more difficult to learn, and in some cases the percussive sounds might even be easier to associate with certain other things. And so what this is saying is that it's possible to dramatically lower the annoyance for both patients and for medical professionals by changing these envelope structures, and it seems like we can do that in a way that doesn't harm the things that are good about the alarms, their communicative value. So in this sense, I think there's a lot of potential for future work improving the kinds of sounds that we use in medical devices, independent of some of the other improvements that we need to make in the number of times they're alerting and the ways in which the machines are going forward and working out. So I just wanted to wrap up by making a few acknowledgments here. First off, we've got a great team back in the lab that's working on various issues related to these, both in theoretical context and in the applied context, like I talked to you here. The annoyance data there is taken from a thesis from a master's student. It's currently under review, and I look forward to moving that forward to share that information with the world. I'm very interested to hear feedback from anyone. Maybe send me an email since we're not here actually in person at the conference at the moment. So thank you so much for your attention for this virtual video. I think there's a lot of potential for using these principles taken from music cognition to help improve the kinds of sounds that we're using in medical devices, and I look forward to talking with anyone who's interested about this in the future.